And with that, I would now like to formally begin today's conference and introduce Luke Hanna.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Annex 4 environmental webinar titled The Effects of Electromagnetic Fields on Marine Animals. As Colin mentioned, my name is Luke Hanna. I'm a researcher at P&L, and I'm going to be the other moderator for today's webinar and moderating the Q&A sessions. Today's webinar is going to provide an overview of EMF in the marine environment, how additional EMF signatures for marine renewable energy devices may affect certain marine organisms, and how research efforts are addressing this issue. We are joined today by two researchers who are focusing their efforts in enhancing our understanding on how additional EMF signatures may affect marine organisms. The first presenter today will be Andrew Gill. Andrew has 20-plus years experience as a fish and fisheries ecologist and is currently a senior lecturer within the Center of Offshore Renewable Energy and Engineering School of Energy, Environment and Agri-Food at Cranfield University in the UK. Andrew's principal research is contributing significantly to our understanding of the ecological impact of offshore marine renewable energy developments, and he has advised on a number of environmental impact assessments both UK-wide and internationally, principally in relation to the topic of electromagnetic fields. Andrew was recently the lead author on a book chapter concerning the EMF in marine renewables and has published a number of well-cited, peer-reviewed, and more mainstream articles on the marine environment, EMF, and renewable energy. Our second presenter today will be Dr. Ann Bull. Ann is the Chief Environmental Scientist at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, in the Pacific region. With a background in biochemistry and marine biology, Ann's research interests focus on the ecological influence and effects of offshore energy installations at both the local and regional scale. She is presently a member of the Board of Directors of the Southern California Academy of Sciences and the Chief of Environmental Sciences, BOEM Pacific Outer Continental Shelf region, where she oversees the very large studies programs on the OCS of California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Luke, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, whoever you are. Thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to do this presentation with you. Like I said, I'm the warm-up act for Ann Bull, and hopefully this will provide you with some good summary information about where we are with the understanding of EMF in relation to marine animals. And please, yes, if there's any questions at the end, we'll be very happy to try and address them the best that we can. So, okay, let's go to the first slide. So basically, I just thought I'd just start out by giving a sort of an overview of what we're talking about, because electromagnetic fields is a kind of a slightly sort of ethereal topic area that a lot of people have some problems sort of getting their head around, because as humans, we at the moment don't believe that we can detect them, although, you know, that there are some people say that they might be able to, but generally speaking, we don't know. We know that they're kind of there, we can go out and measure them, but actually understanding where they come from, their sources, and how they influence the world around us is actually very pertinent to the topic. So we actually live in an electromagnetic field world, to be honest. This diagram has got 4 pictures on it. If you start at the top left and work around in the clockwise fashion, essentially the top one is showing really a sort of a pretty picture of the sun and its influence on the Earth, which is the tiny thing there which I'm highlighting with my cursor. And you can see these lines, and this is electromagnetic field. So we get EMF coming from the solar radiation, and it affects, you know, the whole of the solar system. On the right-hand side, the top right-hand side, we've got what looks like a contour map, and essentially that is a geomagnetic field map showing you the electromagnetic field which exists, or the geomagnetic field that exists according to different parts of the Earth, and this comes through the rotation of the Earth's core, and a variety of internal mechanisms to the planet. And what you can see is that there are areas which are similar, that hence the lines, and we get changes going from the equator up to the poles. So this is around us all the time. The bottom right-hand figure is a really neat figure, which looks like a sort of mountain landscape, but actually what that is an electromagnetic field map of an island in New Zealand. And essentially what we've got is we've got water bodies, we've got rivers, we've got areas of urban development, and this is just showing you that even at a sort of a smaller scale than the globe, we've actually got differences. We've got a topography of EMF, which is out there, which obviously we live within, and so do the animals that share the planet with us. And then the bottom left-hand diagram is from the recent chapter that we wrote, and it's essentially trying to summarize some of these things. So you can see that the magnetic fields coming from the sun, creating electromagnetic fields within the oceans because of what's called MIV, which is emotionally induced voltage. So the salt water moving through the magnetic field creates electric fields, so we get this tight combination of electric and magnetic fields. We've got stuff coming from the atmosphere, and also in this diagram, this illustrates some of the anthropogenic influences, such as subsea cables. We've got some wind farms here, and essentially generation of electricity on land. Everywhere around you, computers you're looking at, all the devices around you at work and at home, they do emit some kind of EMF signal. So it is out there, we just are not very good at detecting it. However, there are lots of organisms that are, and this slide really just summarizes that from bacteria, which is the green organism on screen, all the way through to the blue whale, we've got organisms right through the taxonomic spectrum that are able to detect or orientate to magnetic and electromagnetic fields. What we tend to do when we're talking about the marine environment is we focus on this list here, which are sort of the larger species, the sort of megafauna, and we've got a variety of taxa here. We've got the sharks, skates, and rays, the lampreys, which are predominantly sensitive to the electric field, and then we have things like crustaceans, mollusks, whales, dolphins, turtles, and some fish, which are more sensitive, according to current knowledge, to the magnetic fields. But there is a link between the electric and magnetic components. And certainly within the bony fish, things like sturgeons, etc., are able to detect electric fields as well. So there are a lot of animals that have evolved within this electromagnetic environment and utilize these. So how do they utilize them? Well, this is just a diagram just to get us to think about that. If you take the figure on the left-hand side, which is obviously the UK here, and this is just a marine habitat map. And essentially, if you're living within that environment, you want to move around, you want to find your way to productive feeding grounds, you want to find your way to areas where it might be spawning areas, reproductive areas, etc. So we know that there's differences in the environment, and there will be differences in the electromagnetic environment as well on a sort of a more local level. And our understanding is that a lot of organisms will orientate to some of the predominant geomagnetic influences, the magnetic fields that are present, and find their way around their habitats in order to try and find the appropriate habitat. On the right-hand figure is actually just showing you the movement of Atlantic salmon, which is one of the species of bony fish, which we know will respond to magnetic fields, and the idea is that they travel over large distances, and the evidence to date suggests that they use the geomagnetic cues as one of the main reasons and one of the main cues in order to move around that environment. So if we start thinking about how we might be influencing that environment, what I'm showing here is just it's actually an engineering model. This is a finite element modeling method, which is looking at a industry standard subsea cable. And what we've got here, just to orientate you, is we've got the large sort of donut shape is the outside of the cable. So just imagine any cable, and then we've got the inside. And inside this cable, we've got 3 other smaller cables. And as you can see, they are the ones that transmit the electricity. And in this situation, this is an alternating current cable called a 3-phase cable, and we have these differences in colors on the different parts of the cables. And this is essentially the nearer you are to red, the higher the magnetic field that is produced. We also know that based on the characteristics of the cable, this is just internal to the cable at the moment. So we get an electric field within the cable generated, and we get a magnetic field generated through the current moving through. So they're both interrelated. This goes back to 1800s and Michael Faraday and the law of electromagnetic induction, that if you have one, you can induce the other one. So essentially, this is a model showing what's going on inside a typical 132 kilovolt cable. So we can assume that that's the kind of thing that's going to be happening in any cable, and it's scalable by power rating. On the right-hand side, we zoom out. The little dot is essentially that cable zoomed down to a very small size and simulated in this model buried to a meter below the seabed. And what you can see is that we've shielding, the material that's holding the cable doesn't actually stop the magnetic field being emitted. That magnetic field then goes out into the seabed and into the surrounding seawater, and because seawater is saline, it is conductive, and then you actually can get an induced electric field within the salt water. The other thing is, because in this case, an alternating current field, we get a movement of the magnetic field, and that movement induces fields within the seawater as well. The other kind of cable we've got is a static DC cable, which basically means it's off or on, and so you wouldn't get this sort of time-varying rotational sort of variability in the magnetic field, but you will get an emission that goes out into the seawater, and anything passing through that, such as a fish, a salmon moving through it, can detect it, has the ability, and then also, even if you have tides moving through it, water moving through it, you will induce. So, based on that, we've got predictions, and these are two graphs that have come from an extensive report that was conducted a few years back. And what we've got here in the top left hand is the alternating current predictions from different types of industry standard subsea cables. And what you can see is we've got at the middle, the zero is where the axis of the cable would be. And then you can see, depending on the configuration of the cable, the number of bundles, how far apart the cables are, you get these different patterns with a sort of a peak coming in towards the middle for the majority of them. And the field we're looking at here on the scale, just to get you sort of focused in, we're talking about, this is in micro-Tesla, so this is millionths of Tesla. And essentially, if we relate that to the geomagnetic field is around about 30 to 70 micro-Teslas, depending where you are in the world. So we're looking at sort of comparable levels, slightly below the magnetic field. If we look at the DC cables at the bottom right hand, similar idea. And what you can see again is we've got cables. If you ignore the sort of the saddle one, but the other ones, where we've got a peak along the cables and a drop-off, sort of exponential drop-off as we go with distance, around about 5 to 10 meters either side, and that depends obviously on the power going through the cable. And in this case here with the saddle, we've essentially got two cables that are quite far apart, and therefore they're creating two separate signals, and also are being additive in the middle there. So we've got, this is what we predict in the water from different existing cables. So we are adding to that environment. If you look at the magnetic field for the DC cables, that is up in the hundreds of microteslas, so obviously is above geomagnetic fields. So just to sort of summarize that, we've got our EMF. We can split it into two parts. So there's the EM, the electric side, and the magnetic side. And basically, in a standard cable, industry cable, the electric field that's directly emitted is retained within the cable. The magnetic field isn't retained and is emitted out into the surrounding environment. And in the seawater, that can induce an electric field because of the conductivity of the water. And this is kind of summarized in the figure I'm just showing here, which is looking at the top is an unshielded cable, which is what we wouldn't expect to be in the water because it will emit an electric field and a magnetic field here, which is signified by B field. And this is the kind of cable you would have on land, so it's the buzzing cables that you see in from the pylons, which aren't shielded. But the engineering principles, we don't do that in seawater. So the one in the middle is essentially a DC cable showing the electric field retained within the cable, but the magnetic field being outside of the cable, and obviously then could be within the ability of being encountered by, in this case, a salmon. And then the bottom one is essentially showing you the alternating current, the three cores here, and showing you've got a time-varying signal. In the UK and Europe, that'll be 50 hertz, 50 cycles a second. In the US, that'll be 60. So the predictions are that it's out in the water. Now, why is it of interest to us? We know that there are cables out there already. That's true. However, the interest in actually putting more cables on the seabed is growing dramatically, and a lot of that has been linked to the offshore renewable industry. And you can see in the figure on the left-hand side here the sort of areas that are being sort of planned out potentially for offshore wind and other offshore renewable energy devices. A lot of activity, and all of these are there to create electricity, so therefore they will have a network of cables associated with them. There are also plans within the sort of the distribution network to have, sort of large grid systems on the seabed to export energy, to import energy, and to move it around between neighboring countries. And this is anywhere in the world you find this is something that's been proposed a lot. So the numbers of cables and the density of cables sort of per unit area certainly in some cases is going to be a lot more than we currently got. So again, the question comes up, is that of relevance? Is that going to have anything to do with the changes to any sensitive taxa? So looking at marine renewables, it could be talking about any marine renewables here, but they have been the focus because of the intercabling between the different devices. And this picture on the bottom right hand is essentially sort of a diagram illustrating the situation where we could have a number of cables hanging down the water column, running along the seabed, and then being collected in some kind of substation or some kind of collector, and then transformed or upgraded with higher rating cables. And all the time the industry is pushing forward with higher specification cables. Therefore, the emissions, based on what we understand from the modeling, will go up accordingly. And this is a diagram. It's obviously a bit of an exaggeration in terms of you don't get turtles the size of ocean-going vessels. But the idea here is just to illustrate that this is what might be going on the seabed in terms of we've got cables that are emitting the fields. Doesn't really matter on what kind of devices you're talking about. You've got some devices may emit fields themselves, such as some of these shrouded turbines, but that can be easily mitigated if it's necessary. And then you have the collector and then the larger field going to shore. So basically, the evidence today is that yes, there will be EMF in the water, and it will be in more densely located than we have had previously. Just to highlight something which is very important when we're talking about the sort of environmental impact, etc., is the definition of how we use this. And this is something that if anybody's heard me talk before, I do sort of talk about a few times, because I think it's really important to try and get our heads around the idea that we will potentially have some change to say the response of a particular animal to say something like EMF. But the real key for us is to understand whether that has any biological significance. Is it something which is going to impact at the level, and the level we usually look at is the sort of population level. And it is important because a lot of the studies that we're doing are at this level here in this diagram. This diagram is basically taking us through marine renewable energy, it's like a stressor receptor sort of pathway kind of thing. And we look at effects at short term, single effects, we look at multiple effects over the long term, etc. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to collect the data which will then help us inform this level, which is the changes to populations and communities. But sometimes we mix these two terms up. Whether you use effect or impact, you can have that debate. But actually, we need to be clear what we mean. And it's are we having some kind of biologically significant effect stroke impact that we're really interested in, that we're trying to look at to see whether there's something we might need to mitigate. Whether we get a response or not, that's not the end of the story. We need to take it further, and I think that's something that distracts us sometimes, is that we see a response and we immediately say that that's detrimental or it might be positive, but we need to demonstrate that this is an actual biologically significant effect, and that's really important regardless of what organisms you're talking about. So we need to move from level 4 to level 5 when we're considering these such questions. Looking at the pathways to effect, this is a diagram which is really looking at the operational phase of offshore renewables, because that's where we've been sort of focusing our efforts on. So during construction there won't be any EMF, but during operation there will be potentially the question of effects of the emitted EMF. Then we've got these responses or these effects that I was mentioning. We could have, for instance, a change in movement patterns. We could have animals that are moving around in different ways as a result of the exposure or encounter with these. That might be related to navigation over long distances, such as the eel or salmon migration, or it might be more local orientation to features, habitats, etc. Which we know a number of animals actually orientate to certain features, magnetic features such as seamounts. It might be that people are worried about, is there going to be some kind of avoidance, that this is going to create some kind of non-visual barrier which stops things going by. Or alternatively, it might be within the range that actually attracts attention, because a number of these animals utilize particularly the electric fields that are emitted by animals, bioelectric fields, to find food. This is the principal mode of finding food in the sort of final stages of predation for a lot of elasmobranchs and the sturgeons, etc. So it might then have potentially a change to predator-prey, which is obviously something we're interested in at a population level. but it might have changes that may occur because of the way that these organisms try and find their food, or some kind of habitat feature, or it may actually have some physiological effects. So, could it affect things like reproduction? Could it affect developmental changes in eggs? We know from laboratory studies with some high magnetic fields that sea urchin eggs, for instance, can be changed in their developmental stages. So we've got questions, we've got sort of tantalizing questions coming out of some of the studies, the few studies that have been done. But ultimately, again, we're interested to know whether there's any significant biological change, either in health, sort of the acute level of something, being majorly affected in terms of their survivability, or the more sort of subtle but more ecologically relevant things, which are things like the longer-term reproductive success, etc. And we've got the main categories of animals that we are interested in. There's the marine mammals and turtles, which we know utilize the magnetic fields for moving over distances. Fish, whether that's bony fish or cartilaginous fishes, and some of the invertebrates as well. So we know that they have the ability to detect, and we've got some studies which give us some illustration that they have an ability to respond. So what is that evidence? This is a bit of a wordy slide, but it's just really trying to summarize some of the outputs that we've got from some of the research. It's not comprehensive, covering everything, but we know a little bit, but we still need to know more. But essentially, just to summarize the bullet points, that we know that the species that are more electrosensitive can detect both AC and DC signals. We know that the primarily magnetic sensitive species are probably able to detect AC cables, but most likely to respond to the DC cables, which is the greatest signal above the geomagnetic field. We've got evidence from some studies, and I'm going to show a couple of examples of attraction to cables by certain sensitive organisms, but we can't extrapolate that to impact. That would be pure speculation, and that's something which a lot of people have asked me, and we haven't got the information to move towards any biologically significant impact. And the other thing that's interesting is that the majority of organisms that are likely to interact with EMF and then therefore maybe have some interaction are those that live either within the seabed or function within the sort of benthic ecosystem. And that's quite important to think about because of where the source of this is coming from, which is the subsea cables. Of course, there are cables that are going to be coming from devices hanging from the surface. That is something we've not really looked at, and it's something that, looking at encounters, probabilities of encounters might actually help us understand whether that's something to be considering. Some examples. P&L are hosting this webinar, so I thought I'd wave the flag for them. They're doing a lot of some good laboratory studies on a variety of different species, and they've got some sort of tantalizing sort of evidence coming from some of the studies, but a lot of the studies are not showing any significant effects of particularly magnetic fields. But there are some like the tantalizing evidence, such as changes in swimming activity, possibly in terms of stress response, some development delay, but quite high, relatively high fields, some changes to growth, but not some species, but not other species. So it's a bit tantalizing. These are potential sort of effects or the sort of responses, but in terms of any impact, we're a long way away. So just to sort of use some illustrations from some of the work that I've been involved in, just to look at how we've been trying to understand things. We've done a number of laboratory studies, and this is just a summary of a couple of them, which I just want to share with you, utilizing an electrosensitive benthic shark species. And what we've got here is just two figures from a part of a study, which is looking at two different fields. So this is a DC single point field, and a field which is 10 times greater than when you compare the two of them. And what this is saying is that at the levels which are equivalent to the kinds of fields that these guys are exposed to when they're hunting for, and they're quite similar to the fields that are associated with cables, that they prefer a higher intensity, so almost 10 times higher intensity field. So this is a stimulus. There's no food involved here. This is just a stimulus to see how they respond. So this is the number of choices, so a much higher response to a higher field. What's more interesting is this one here. which is we looked at whether they could tell a difference between a natural or bioelectric field coming from a crab and an artificial field that we created, which is a very sort of static DC field. And we expected them to be able to tell the difference. This was done using an agar chamber, so that what that does is it stops any other stimuli such as scent or movement, and basically just allows the bioelectric field to come out. So this is the crab here, and then the artificial field again inside an agar chamber. And even though we increased the sample size quite dramatically to try and demonstrate if there was any difference, there turned out to be no difference. So that suggests that from an electromagnetic perspective, they're not telling the difference between a natural food item like a crab and an artificial field. Of course, that's just from electromagnetic perspective. But these are predators, so are they really that stupid, or is there something else going on? Here we've got some traces of their movement around laboratory, looking at this is a typical sort of behavioral type conditioning experiment where we were rewarding or not rewarding them. And what you can see is we've got the electric field in the middle here, we've got the release point of the fish, and things moving around, and as they weren't rewarded, they spend more time swimming around looking for food and not responding to the emission, and then eventually giving up over a period of about 10 days. However, if you reward them, if you look at the spaghetti pictures here, the spaghetti gets much, much shorter, and by the end of the time they've learned that actually if they go and find the electric field, they will actually get some food. So that demonstrates their ability to learn. So again, that's really important, because if we think that they are responding to cables, then can they habituate, can they learn about it? That's something important. They have that ability. So we've also then been trying to take the laboratory out into the field, and this is really a study that was done because the industry obviously were being asked to look into this, but they were not confident that data from laboratory studies would be sufficient to understand whether there's anything that they need to take into account when they're doing things like the environmental impact. So here we've got a study that we did back in 2008, 2009, which is essentially a large fish cage. These are people here from the west coast of Scotland floating out a cage. We had two cages, and these were 40 meters in diameter by 5 meters in depth, and put onto the seabed in about 10 to 15 meters of water over here. The principle was basically taking a laboratory study of a treatment here and a reference next door to it, treating them exactly the same, apart from one had a cable and one didn't. Cable turned on and one didn't. The other one had a dummy cable. We then repeated this study with another set of fish in both of these mesocosms, disconnected the cable, connected it here, and looked at the response, and then did it a third time with different individuals, again, of different types, two different species. The outcomes for that were, as in all animal behavior studies, there are variable outcomes, but essentially just showing you the kinds of things we were finding was that for some of the ray species, so this is the skates or rays, depending which part of the world you're from, when the cable was turned on, this is an image from the GIS output, the data. The blue dots are those dots when the cable was on, and this is showing an orientation towards the cable, and during the yellow time the cable was off, and this is before and after the cable turn on. So this is an example of an individual responding to the cable, so that's interesting. And then at the bottom, with another species, we demonstrated that there was a non-random distribution, and they're more likely to be nearer the cable when energized. So this is basically suggesting that at the levels of the cable we used, which were similar to those predicted, that these kinds of animals were associating more with the cable, albeit quite a high, variable output. Another study, which is a field-based study, so scaling up, is being done by Hacke-Vesterberg and colleagues, and this is looking at eel migrations. This is a magnetically sensitive species in general, and this is really interesting because this is one cable here in the Baltic Sea, and they had a number of transmitters and used acoustic methods again to look at the movement of the fish, and released them and looked at their passage over different parts of this particular part of the sea. And what was interesting is here, this relationship shown is how that they reduced in their swimming speed as they were in the area where the cable was. They didn't stop them going over, but they reduced their swimming speed, and this lasted for about 40 minutes. So from an encounter perspective, there was some response, but from an impact perspective, the interpretation was 40 minutes in the migration of an eel is not very much at all, which is fair enough. So that illustrates this effect-impact aspect. But what is interesting is if this happens each time they go over a cable, then we start to ask questions in the same way that if birds migrate around a wind farm, then is that a major issue in terms of their migration and energy burn up? But if you have it occurring every time they come across a wind farm, then ecologically the argument is that there could be some potential costs to them. So a similar sort of argument can occur with these. But again, we don't know enough, but it's something which is giving us some evidence of responses. So to summarize, we've got some studies out there. We've been doing studies based from highly controlled laboratory studies through to sort of laboratory in the field all the way through to field studies that indicate that there are responses to the two types of cables. There's also anecdotal evidence. Some people have seen things on YouTube of deep sea sharks grabbing cables, etc. We've got some reports from the telecommunications industry showing that they've had damage to cables. So there is something going on, but whether it's something majorly significant is the question we don't really have an answer to. So that relates us to point number 2, that we have a low confidence in our knowledge about any impacts, but we know that there is some kind of response. So that's the important move between effect and impact. The other thing that's interesting is it just doesn't have to focus just on the marine renewable sector. This is about subsea cables, so other technologies that use subsea cables. And also what's interesting is it's scalable, so the more power you put in the cable, it's almost like a linear effect, and it's going to be greater in terms of the amount of output. So again, we've got interest here when we're talking about larger rating cables feeding networks. It's also important because now we've got a driver in terms of regulation, and from a European perspective, we have this Article 11, which is the one that people quote a lot about underwater noise, but actually it relates just to energy, including noise. And that also then includes things like EMF. So we do actually have to consider it through the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is focusing from an ecological perspective. So it is something that is on the horizon that we need to look at. And then also, some environmental impact assessments in different parts of the world are requiring the consideration of EMF. However, to date, some of the guidance has not reflected the evidence base to date, and a lot of it is a little bit dismissive of the situation. And whilst if that's the case, great, let's move on, but we don't actually have the evidence base for it. So let's get the evidence base to then determine whether this is something that we need to be considering, particularly from an ecological perspective in the longer term. So just finally to say something, how are we going to fill some of these gaps? There is projects ongoing at the moment, and I direct you to this is the Marvin Project, where we're actually coming toward the end of this project, but it's a collaborative study, and a lot of this sort of work has to be done collaboratively because we're all asking similar questions. And cables in the Baltic Sea are the same as cables in the off the east coast of the US, as in the Mediterranean, with very, very similar features. So we can do this. But we've got a project where we're actually looking at measuring whether these things are in the environment or not, because the models tell us they are. So here's some preliminary data which is to be reported on, so please do not use this without any permission, but I'm showing it just to give you an illustration that there is going to be some data coming out showing that this is an output. This is an output from a Belgian wind farm, and we've got 3 different movements going through the wind farm with a bespoke EMF sensor. It's not the easiest thing to measure, but certainly the electrical component. But this is showing the electrical component on this side and the magnetic component on the right-hand side, and 3 drift patterns: the red, the green, and the black, and that relates to these different colors. And what you can see is there's a sort of a peak coming in different parts of this, and that relates to these stars that are in this part of the graph here. And those stars line up, and essentially this is, if you overlay a map of the cable, this is an inter-array cable which has been detected at 18 meters from the seabed by the device that was hanging from a boat here. These graphs are showing you how near they were to the actual turbines. So essentially, it's not about coming from the turbines, it's actually related to the cables. So we don't think there's much signature from the turbines, but there is some signature from the cables, both from an electric and a magnetic perspective. And these levels, again, are in the region of micro to millivolts per meter, and in microteslas as well. The other thing is that we can learn from other industries, or at least work with them. A lot of people haven't looked at this, but there are cables all over which we could start working with. There are other industries using cables. For example, is an observatory in the Monterey Bay where they've got a power cable running across, and they have to do an EIA on this cable. And they've got evidence in that EIA, which you can find online, of skates associated with parts of the cable in more numbers than you might expect, but that's only done after 2 surveys. But it gives you some indication that there might be something that we can learn from other industries as well. And just to sort of finish off, we've got a project which is being funded by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in the US here that we're involved in at the University of Rhode Island of running this summer. And we're actually looking at, this is the very large DC cable that feeds essentially Manhattan Island. This is the Long Island cross-sand cable. And we're going to be doing some studies looking at the cable generation and looking at the EMF coming from that, and also doing some sort of cage-based mesocosm experiments, looking at lobsters, looking at American eels, and looking at escaped species. To again see if we're getting how the response might occur with multiple individuals to a generation cable, which is quite high-powered DC. So the study is still ongoing, but we still need more efforts, and efforts across the world would be good. I'm going to rush through this slide because time's moving on, but the other thing is that this is just really saying that we've got devices which are being built. To my knowledge, there's about 3 different devices in the world. This is one of them from Sweden that are being built to try and measure EMF. The magnetic field can be measured through some commercial devices, although sensitivity is a question. This is a magnetic field sensor, but the full electric side and the magnetic signals need to be measured through some quite sophisticated technologies. So it's an area which is being developed at the moment. And what remains? What's the future? Well, basically, we need to understand more about interactions with the cables, but also this is a picture of the power system of a cable. This is the cable going across the sea, and you've got all this other stuff going on, which is creating the electricity generation and the distribution network to whoever needs the power. So we've got to understand that system as well. So the study that we're involved in with Boehm and University of Rhode Island is looking at this aspect as well, to understand the variability in this point, which is the bit in the sea, as a result of the whole power system. And so the questions that we still don't know are, if we've got animals that we know can respond and we've seen have some kind of response, we don't think there's going to be any aversion, certainly within the ranges that we're looking at. So this line here is showing you the barrier effect. But as cables get bigger, it's something that we don't know, so we need to look at. But is it a situation where we might have some attraction going on unless there's any habituation or learning by the... And what does that mean when we've got multiple encounter? So that's the ecological argument. Do we have a situation where every time an animal comes across a cable, it will try and bite it or will try and associate with it? And what does that mean in terms of the other things, activities it would be doing? That's important at the local scale, obviously, but also from migratory species moving over large distances. Are they going to respond like the eels did every time they come across a cable, and therefore creating potentially high energetic burden in terms of the time spent and the energy expended, not getting to the site they need to? And then the other bit we don't really have much information on is the early life stage response. We've been doing some studies, as well as others in other parts of the world, that demonstrate that some species, even at the egg stage, are able to detect EMF. And is that something that, particularly for species that utilize benthic deposits of eggs, that might use sort of cables to attach them to, is that something that developmentally we need to be considering? So some really tantalizing questions. We need to look at the bigger questions in terms of, are these responses predictable? Are these responses repeatable across a number of individuals? And therefore, do they have any impact at the population level? And with that, I will finish off, and thank you for your interest and attention.
Hi, this is Ann Bull from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Good morning, everybody from the Pacific Coast. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate the invitation to present these slides. My name is Ann Scarborough-Bull, and I am the Chief of the Sciences for the Pacific region of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And I will be using, undoubtedly, the term BOEM during my presentation, and just try to remember that I'm using the acronym for the United States federal agency that I'm working for. I just wanted to stop a moment and speak to what the program goals are for my agency. We regulate the leasing of United States outer continental shelf for the purposes of energy production. And our program goals for our study is to acquire the information needed for assessment and management of environmental impacts. So we attempt to predict the impacts on the marine biota, and we monitor the human, marine, and coastal environments. That's just part of the emphasis that we place on our program. So today I'm going to be speaking to BOEM-supported, BOEM-funded efforts that are attempting to fill some data gaps, and these apply only, the ones I'm going to be talking about, we've done on the Pacific Coast. In the previous presentation, Andrew did indicate that BOEM is also funding studies on the East Coast, so I'm just going to be speaking to West Coast efforts that we've made. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the three main studies that we have funded. The first one is actually completed, and this is the Normando study that Andrew spoke about, and it's about the effects of EMF from undersea power cables on elasmobranchs and other marine species. That's the link to the final study, and the PDF download is at that location. The second study I'll be talking about is something that we took into the field, and we actually observed fish and invertebrates at on the seafloor on actual cables, and I'll be talking about that. And the final report will be coming out for that very soon, by the end of the summer. And the third one we just started. It'll be coming out in summer 2017, and it's looking at the potential impacts of submarine power cables on crab harvest, and this also is a field-based study, and I'll be explaining all three of these. So let's go on to the first one, which is essentially a literature search and synthesis. It was done by, we had a consultant do it, Normando and Associates, and this study was managed by my BOEM colleague Donna Schrader here in the Pacific region. The objectives were to describe and quantify predicted EMF, in other words, to build a model to compile information on these sensitive marine species, and to try to understand what some of this information meant. So the methods, they just gathered a tremendous amount of information, and I just want to point out a couple of things. They have some of Andrew Gill's studies. They have some of the first studies done by Calmeen. Peter Kimley's studies is here, and this is only one page of many pages that summarizes the literature and what has been done. It talks about specific species, and these tables have been generated for marine mammals, for sea turtles, for fish. So there's a tremendous amount of data and a tremendous amount of information. It is up through 2010. It was started in 2009, published in 2011, but it does contain the information up till 2010. Now, a lot of work has been done after that, but it's good up till then, and it's a great basics subject to go to. So if anybody out there needs to get the basics about EMF and some understanding of where we were up till about 2010, this is the place to go. They also modeled, this is very similar to some things that Andrew showed us. They modeled EMF, and some of the characteristics become apparent that the response, or the EMF, the strong EMF field, is directly over the cable, and it falls off rapidly on either side of that. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Other information that they did was they actually put down information about all the tables that they could find information about up until 2010. So here's the cross-sound cable that Andrew will be working on for BOEM on the Atlantic coast, and it gives you a lot of information about these cables. This is the only place I know where the information about existing cables has actually been taken together. So here's just a few of the findings. There's a lot of findings. The anticipated EMF from power cables, they can be modeled easily if you know certain information like the burial depth, cable design, magnetic permeability, and the current loading, etc. And as Andrew said before, these behavioral responses to and some effects, they're known for a few species, but extrapolation to many other species or to population impacts is speculative. We're at the effects stage, and we're trying to reach that level 5, that impact stage. And it certainly would not be appropriate to take effects information from, let's say, a crab and transfer it, and extrapolate that to a turtle. So the next study that I'm going to talk about, study number 2, is titled The Renewable Energy in Situ Power Cable Observation. And the question was, does EMF from a power cable attract or repulse fish or invertebrates? This is in the field. We had a tremendous in situ opportunity where we have power cables from onshore power plant. These are 35 kilovolt AC power cables. They're all the same cable. They were made in the same run by the same manufacturer, and they were installed by the same techniques at the same time. And these power cables actually power offshore oil and gas platforms. One of these cables that were first installed failed, and it's been cut off at the state-federal line. So so obviously this cable is absolutely dead. It's been cut off at both ends and buried right up here at the state-federal line. And this is the cable that was in place, that was installed. It's the same cable from the same run by the same manufacturer, so it's essentially the same cable. But we have a dead cable and we have a live cable. I might use the terms hot and cold interchangeably as I go forward through this presentation. So they had this perfect setup where we could discount habitat conditions because we had the same habitat conditions. We had a hot cable and a cold cable, the same cable, so we could discount habitat effects. The objectives were to actually measure on the cable and away from the cable the strength, spatial extent, and variability of EMF, and it was to determine whether there was attraction or repulsion of fishes or macroinvertebrates to the EMF from the cables, and to determine the effectiveness of the commonly proposed mitigation of cable burial. So these are the methods that we used for this. We did video surveying. This is what it looks like. I hope you can see the pointer. Here's what it looks like in the green shallow water. And we did video surveys using scuba in shallow water, and we used a submersible, this little submersible from Canada, to do our deep water surveys on the hot and cold cables. And we ran transects, 15-minute transects. We identified all species of macroinvertebrates or fish along those cables. We also measured the EMF. We had a pressure capable and water proof EMF meter built, and we had it certified and calibrated by the Integrity Design and Research Group. The stick with the red balls, that's actually a measuring stick, and we have marked on this, we know when we have the two balls on the center of the cable, it's essentially a 90-degree angle, and that is the measurement at 1 meter away from the measuring device, which is back on the sub-arm. So we were able to measure 1 meter, 3/4 of a meter, half a meter, and 1/4 meter from the measuring device. In the shallow water, as I told you a couple of slides ago, the power cable that was dead, the cold cable, was cut off at the state line and removed completely. That was a requirement of the state and county at the time that was removed. So we didn't have a cold cable in shallow water. So there is, however, a pipeline in shallow water, and we use that as a proxy for an unenergized, a cold cable, and we measured the EMF, and I'll show that in a minute. So what we have done, even in deep water using the sub and in shallow water, is we have done transects on the sand or mud, in shallow water on the pipeline, in deep water on the cold cable, and we have hot cable in both locations, and we measure that on the cable. So this is the actual measurements as found by scuba and by submersible. Here's the pipeline measurement. It's at 0.5 of a microtesla. Here's the cable measurement using scuba and using submersible. Here's at 0.5 meter, here's at 1 meter, and here it is on the mud and the sand. And that's our measurements. So we did decide that using the cable as proxy was allowable under this case. This gives you a video grab of what the cable looks like. So these are some findings. This is one of the ways that we anticipate that we're going to report this data and publish it. This is the average number of fishes observed in the shallow depths using scuba on the cable, pipe, and sand habitats. And these are the basic numbers, and this is what the numbers look like so far. There doesn't seem to be much difference between the cable or the pipe, and this would be the proxy for the cold cable. This is the hot cable, and this is the sand. These are relatively early numbers. We certainly haven't finished. Here's the multi-dimensional scaling of all fish species by habitat. Again, this is hot, cold, and sand for all fish species by habitat in the shallow areas. And it's pretty much a confetti diagram. There's nothing that's patterning out that would indicate attraction or repulsion. Colin, I'm having a lot of trouble moving from slide to slide. Okay, I got that one finally. Here's some findings from the deep water from the sub dives. This is 24 species of fish, and this is the energized cable, the unenergized cable, and the mud. So this is what you consider hot, cold, and no habitat over on the mud. And this is the densities that we're getting per 100 meters squared. And there's certainly a difference between cable habitat and no cable habitat, but there's not much showing up so far in our analyses. Here's the multidimensional scaling. Now I'm reading a message from Colin. Thank you, Colin. This is the multidimensional scaling by all fish species by habitat from 1 to 2 years of the submersible data. And just about the time that you feel like things are going to pattern out, then you get mixed messages from that. So this is not showing out. These are observations from hot cables, from cold cables, and from the mud, all at the same time during the same days. All right, this is the invertebrate densities. 16 species. Again, this is hot cable, cold cable, and no cable. Okay, this is MacroInvertebrates, and this is from the study number 2. You get sometimes very interesting results. if you look at the upper left, we're going to start with sea cucumbers. Sea cucumbers are euphoroids. They are essentially sediment ingesters. They eat mud. This particular species is called Parasticopus. That's what we run into in California. So these guys are sediment eaters. Sea slugs, the top right, these are Aplesias. They are herbivores, and that's what you get with them. The corals and gorgonians, of course, are have to be attached to a solid substrate. This is what you get with them. And crabs, and corals and gorgonians are filter feeders. Crabs are opportunistic. So let's take a look at the results here. We're going to start with sea slugs. I will come back to sea cucumbers. There's really not, at least there's not looking like, with the small n that we have, because this is only from the first year's data, there's really no significant impact between no cable at all and the hot cable, which is emitting EMF. For corals and gorgonians that are obligated to be on hard substrate, you would expect to see these kind of results. There's not a great deal of difference showing up between hot or cold habitat, but there's a lot showing up between having a habitat and not having a habitat, which would be mud. Crabs, the same kind of thing. You're really not seeing a significant difference between the EMF emitting the hot cable and mud habitat. But let's take a look at sea cucumbers. There's not much difference between hot cable, the EMF emitting cable, and the mud. But there is a difference between both of these and the cold cable. But there's a huge standard deviation in this, and I'm going to give you what we think is going on here in an upcoming slide. And here it is. These are preliminary findings. Again, I'd like to let you know that we're still analyzing part of the second year and all of the third year of information with a lot higher number of visitations. So what we have going on so far, I would say you can't take these to the bank yet, but they certainly are a deposit. The results suggest that there's no response, attraction, or repulsion from fishes or macroinvertebrates to the EMF that's generated from the 35 kV AC in situ power transmission cable. Now, this particular type of cable, the 35 kV AC cable, so far that I can determine is what the industry in the United States is going to choose for their inter-device cabling. So this is a situation where we had an opportunity to look at exactly what is indicated is going to be the cables that the United States and companies, or whatever companies install in the United States outer continental shelf, is going to be the exact kind of cable, exact type of cable that they're going to be using for the inter-array cables. They will likely use a much higher AC cable or even a DC cable for export of the electrons. So the differences in invertebrate communities, at least to me, appears to be associated. So it may be associated with sediment characteristics close to the cable and the actual species patchy nature of distribution. After we saw that sea cucumbers and actually another species, sea pins, seem to be choosing on the basis of location rather than EMF versus no EMF, we went back and we started running all of these experiments on both sides of the cable. And what we found is it appears for sea cucumbers, because they're sediment ingesters, they eat mud, in some places these cables are lying on the surface. They are not buried. In some cases, there's a little softer sediment associated with a particular place where we're running transects, and you're going to find your mud-dependent species within that cable, right adjacent to the cable, as long as there's the appropriate sediment for them. The transects that we run include from the cable out to 2 meters. that's our box that we run for the transects. So we have space next to the cable that would give us that might be a somewhat different sediment. This is a very important one, the third finding. The actual EMF measured on the cables and away from the cable, the output that we measure, it closely fits the model that was found in the Norman Doe effects literature data search and synthesis. So this was rather exciting to me that it looked like the model that had been developed was very close to actually what you found in nature on the seafloor. So the apparent lack of response, because these cables are on the seafloor, it would indicate that burial may not be always essential for biological reasons. I believe that industry has indicated across the world that they're going to bury cable for safety purposes, for longevity, and for other reasons. But the reason that it might have to be buried may not be for biological reasons. And we're going to be publishing these results in the future, and it's likely that the bone report with all the data will be out before those publications. So I'm going to try to move on quickly to study number 3. And we started this about 8 or 9 months ago. And what we're doing with this one is we're looking at potential impacts of the submarine power cables on crab harvest. We have been speaking to a lot of fishermen in the northwest United States where it appears that the first deep water floating wind installations will occur off of Oregon. And in our meetings with fishermen, they are very concerned that cables in the seafloor, whether laying on the seafloor or buried, are going to present an electrical fence on the seafloor. And these fishermen up there off of Oregon, the most lucrative fishery is the fishery for Dungeness crabs. So they're very concerned about, crabs crawl around on the bottom. They're not up in the water column. They're crawling around right there at maximum exposure of EMF. So we decided that we would test that concern. This is a big issue for them. So we decided we would test it. And we would test this, and the objective was to determine if rock crab, and rock crab are an economically important fish species in the Santa Barbara Channel, and Dungeness crab, we would determine if rock crab and Dungeness crab will cross a power cable and be caught in a commercial baited trap. And then we would try to determine the likely impact on harvest for assessment documents and for planning purposes. And I have some pictures here on this slide. I have an Oregon fisherman, and this is a Dungeness crab trap, and it's kind of a circular trap, and one side of the trap is square. And the bottom photo, the photo beneath that, is a rock crab trap, and they're square. And again, I have a power cable. So what we did is we asked this question: will 2 crab species cross a power cable into a baited trap? And the methods that we used is using commercial crab fishermen and commercial species. And we're going to determine the in situ EMF at AC and DC submarine power cables. We're going to expose rock crabs back to this 35 kV power cable with response choice in the Santa Barbara Channel, and we'll do the same thing with Dungeness crabs, either to a high voltage DC or high voltage AC power cable with response choice in Puget Sound, where they have these cables. So here's the rock crab experimental design for Santa Barbara Channel. We're giving crabs a choice to decide if they will cross a power cable in response to a baited commercial fishing trap. This is a photograph that was taken outside the lab at UC Santa Barbara. Oh, and by the way, we're working study number 2 and study number 3 with Milton Lab and Mary Nishimoto at UC Santa Barbara, so I'm going to call that out to them. So this is the experimental design. You've got the crab induction chamber, and you've got a baited trap choice, and you've got a baited trap choice at equal distances from the introduction chamber, and one of these baited trap choices sit on top of the power cable. We've got these plastic shields, I should say, on the ceiling and the sides of the choice chamber so that the crabs cannot crawl up across the ceiling. They have to walk literally across the cable. And here is, thank you very much, Milton and Mary. I just got a couple of days ago photographs from an experiment that was done in the last week, and this will give you an idea of how it's set up. This is the power cable, and I don't know how good your screen resolution is, but you can actually see the shielding up close on this cable. And this is the baited trap over here, and they have to actually walk over the cable. This is the top center photograph. The bottom left photograph, this is a scuba diver who's actually removed a crab from the baited trap, and here's the power cable, and that crab, here's the crab introduction chamber is down at the bottom. That crab has had to walk over the cable. And the bottom right, that just gives you kind of a better view. We've got the crab introduction chamber and the baited trap to the bottom left, and this is actually the diver on the far bottom left. We have 12 traps set out. 6 of them are set up kind of at a random, I don't even know what the setup nature is, but 6 of them are placed so that if the crab decides they're going to walk over the cable in response to the baited trap, 6 of them make the crab make that choice walking to the west, and 6 of them make the crab make that choice walking to the east. So we're also using male and female crabs. So we have a lot of crab choices going on, but we wanted to make sure that we could handle that. So the preliminary findings, and like I said, you really can't take these to the bank at all. We've only been doing this. However, we've run 332 rock crab experiments. It suggests that rock crabs will walk right over that cable in response to a baited commercial trap. As a matter of fact, somewhere, we only have a couple of, like fewer than 5 crabs that haven't moved at all, that haven't made that choice. And about half of the crabs have decided to go to the to not walk over the cable and walk into a baited trap. It's equally distant, and the other half have decided to walk over the cable to go to it. So they don't seem to care. It doesn't seem to be attraction or repulsion in response to the baited trap. Maybe something like current flow or tidal or something like that, but it does not appear to be anything to do with the EMF. But like I said, you can't take anything of this to the bank, but we certainly are doing a lot of experiments. So that's the contact information if you want to get a hold of me about any of these studies, and I want to thank Nikola Tesla. Mm-hmm. So that's it from Anne.
Great, thank you, Anne. That was great. So we do have one question, and that was regarding your EMF study, the second EMF study that you discussed. Were the observations made as the power in the cable was turned on and off?
No, the power to the offshore platforms is constant. Okay. So we have a constant cable, 35. The AC cable. We have a constant cable, but we have the cable that's cut off, so it's constant. We have a hot cable and a cold cable, and we do our transects with scuba or with the submersible on the same day at the same time. We just run the hot cable and we run the cold cable, and then we run the mud. It's during the same dives that we do these 3 types of transects, and we're diving for days. So I hope that answers the question. the hot cable is never turned on and off. We have during our transects, they're not turned on and off. We have this cold cable and we have the hot cable. We have a number of hot cables to choose from. We certainly have a cold cable, and in the shallow water we have the proxy of the pipeline. Hope that answers the question.
Yep. So another question regarding the hot and cold cable fish study. You presented the results of fish response to the cables as all 24 species combined, but not all species are EMF sensitive. Did you look at just EMF species response, and if so, which species?
No, we look at them all, and that'll be all in the data.
Okay. I'm still waiting for other questions to come in, but I have one for myself. So you both provided a great overview and highlighted some really fantastic studies that have taken laboratory and field approaches to getting at this issue. And so obviously there's benefits and drawbacks with each approach, but in order to really address some of the remaining information and data gaps that you mentioned, Andrew, do you both feel that we should continue to focus on designing laboratory studies in more controlled environments, or are we at a point now where we really should try to understand these effects in the field?
Will I go first? I actually think it's a combination of, because in order to try and understand things like sensitivity, thresholds and ranges, etc., that is extremely difficult to try and do within the field, because the main issue you've got is actually control of the EMF, so what's actually being produced and what's actually coming out the cable. And so at least in laboratory studies, you can replicate your studies under the control conditions and actually help sort of, titrate and calibrate things a bit better. That being said, is that we still, obviously, for the sake of understanding the field conditions and also for being relative to what's going on out there, we should be doing some studies in the field which are building on that. So, for instance, if we can find cables that are producing the fields that are within the sensitive range of those species, then we try and do the studies at the right time of the life history for particular times of the year that they're going to be present, and look to see the relevance of that. So it's the combination of trying to understand first those that are sensitive, what would be the sensitivity parameters that we need to be looking at, and then applying those in the field into the more realistic scenario. Because one of the things that's interesting from the Marvin study that we're currently sort of in progress is that the fields that are being measured, they do vary by generation, as you might expect for something like a wind farm. And so understanding that variability is really important. So regardless of actually doing studies on the animals, we still need to understand that electromagnetic environment. And so, this is where there should be some encouragement to work together between industry, between the sort of regulators and the scientists to try and understand that environment to help us then sort of judge the circumstances in relation to any effects and then any impacts.
This is Anne, if I might. If Andrew's done, are you done? Okay. Andrew and I both went to it wasn't really a conference, it was a meeting, the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, in November of 2012. Got a bunch of us together, the field folks, the lab folks, and we had a conclave for a day where we discussed the very issues that you brought up, Luke, about laboratory versus field. And there's an actual report out from EPRI. PNNL, Andrea Copping was there from PNNL. I was there. Andrew was there. Peter Clemley was there. There's a report out from that, and it talks about advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons, and it actually prioritizes these studies as we move forward. And people may be very interested in that. And it's on the EPRI Electric Power Research Institute website, EPRI website. I also have it I'm sure you can get it, Luke, and I'm sure Andrew gets it. So if anybody's interested in that, contact Luke and then me or Andrew, and I'm sure we can get you the link to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point, and I believe it's also on the Tethys knowledge base as well.
Oh, sure. That's another prime place to go to.
Great. Are there any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, if not, we may just go ahead and end just a little early, but I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar and thank the presenters for the great presentations. A recording of this presentation will be posted on Tethys at the URL on the screen there, tethys.pnl.gov. And so the next Annex 4 environmental webinar is planned for this summer, and that will focus on the role of test centers in evaluating environmental effects of marine energy developments. And so for those of you, just for future reference, for those of you who are not on the webinar mailing list, if you'd like to be, just simply send an email to this email address, and then you will be automatically added to the webinar mailing list. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and have a great afternoon or morning. Thank you.